8.1, Anthony Marco from the Hamilton District Labour Council proposing the City of Hamilton become a living wage employer in 2019. Anthony, if you'd like to make your way to the podium. Nice to see you again. Good morning.
Good to see you. Thank you.
The floor is yours, and you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And certainly, by all means, let me know when I'm getting close, because as per usual, I often go extempore on these topics. So if I tend to go past, let me know. I'm back here 3 years later talking about living wage. If you remember back in 2016, we had a report come back to the previous council, which spoke to a cost of approximately $1.03 million to go from $11.50 an hour up to $15.85 an hour, which is the current living wage in Hamilton. We believe that with the minimum wage increase that happened last year, that the cost for becoming a living wage employer has become much more affordable for the City of Hamilton. We believe that it's time that it happens. I think the big question that probably this council and the city needs to ask itself is a very simple one. Is the City of Hamilton an employer that helps to raise its employees out of poverty, or is the City of Hamilton an employer that helps to keep its employees in poverty? That's the simple question that you have to ask yourself. We have approximately 500 employees in this city that don't make a living wage currently. We are in a situation right now where we have, as far as I understand, economic development workers who go out for the city and reach out to people across the province and across the world trying to bring jobs to this city. And they list them as, we want living wage jobs in this city. We believe in living wage jobs in this city. It's hard to make that argument when you go out there and the city is not paying a living wage to every single one of its employees. We don't deny that a few years ago, and I know that every single year we go through budget crunches, $1.03 million at the time when a lot of other cuts were being made, may have been prohibitive, and we still had people around this oval voting for it, and we appreciate that. You'll also know that as a Labour Council, we've been in touch with, of course, Living Wage Hamilton, we've been in touch with the Poverty Roundtable, and we've been in touch with many stakeholders. And hopefully, if it gets past the first stage today, you will hear a lot of their input going forward. We appreciate that going forward, this is the opportunity, that the way to raise somebody out of poverty is not through donations, it's not through charity, it's through making sure that if you work a full-time job, that you're not living in poverty. That's what it always used to mean when we said we're working a full-time job. We all know that in this city, we used to have one wage earner earning a full-time job, and they could buy a house, buy a car, send their kids off to post-secondary education, and still save money for vacations. We know that now, just to survive and pay rent and pay food, it often takes 1 to 2 jobs per person, per adult in a household, just to be able to afford that. The cost of wages, or the amount of wages, has not kept up with the cost of living in this city. We believe it's time to move there. We know that most of those workers are workers that are casual, summer employees, some of our library employees. And we also know that of all we had concerns a few years ago, so I want to allay the concerns now. A couple concerns came up. Well, how do our union groups feel? Well, I can tell you, as the president of the Labour Council, we've reached out to the union groups like 5167 and other union groups around the city who are tied to the city. They do not have any concerns with moving employees to a living wage. They support moving employees to a living wage. We hope that the cost of it is very affordable. And not only that, we believe that it is very valuable to this city to say the City of Hamilton is a living wage employer. Not only does that, I think, do good for the city when trying to sell itself out in other communities in the province, across Canada, but beyond that, as an anchor institution, as the anchor institution in this city, we want to be able to go to other anchor institutions in this city, like Mohawk, like McMaster, like Hamilton Health Sciences, like the school boards, and make the same argument to them. If you're not paying a living wage to your employees, why aren't you? So we want to be able to make that pitch to them. We want to be able to say, if the City of Hamilton can do it, certainly you can do it as well. That the money that people make, the difference between $14 an hour and $15.85 an hour, is not going to an offshore bank account. It's being spent usually on small businesses in this city. So that's how we feel we want to grow and take one of those first steps to try and help some of the people the working poor in this city. We're not talking necessarily about people who are unemployed just looking for a job. We're talking about people who are actually working 1, 2, and 3 jobs. And if it means that a single mother can work 1 job instead of 2 or 3 jobs, or 2 jobs instead of 3 jobs, then that is a huge step that we can take. Like I say, 500 people in the city of Hamilton isn't going to solve that. But as a model for a lot of the other anchor institutions in the city, we think that it could be a very big step. So as I'm wrapping up here, because I'm getting the signal from the front, I would ask you to consider that question I said earlier. Should the city of Hamilton as an employer be A, helping its employees out of poverty, or B, keeping its employees in poverty? And I think if that's the framework that you use as you consider some of the questions and deliberations over the next little while as we might be considering this, I think it will serve you well. So I thank you for your time.
Thanks, Anthony. I have a questioner in Councillor Nan.
Thank you, through the chair. Thank you, Mr. Marco, for your presentation today. I'm just curious, often there is an argument made that minimum wage is a rate to encourage people who are coming into employment, i.e. young people, and that students don't need a minimum wage or a living wage. Could you speak to that from your experiences and from the Labour Council's perspective? Sure.
I think that the fact that we have so many, using students as a primary example, the fact that we have so many students that are in more debt than they've ever been before, especially with regards to post-secondary education, speaks to the need. And certainly an extra $1.85 an hour isn't necessarily going to solve that, but if it can help them, that is a great step. Plus, in a city where we have not only individuals but families who are working poor, oftentimes student work contributes to the family income. And that is a huge step. So if it's a 35-hour week and it means the difference of an extra $40 for somebody who's doing a student job, that can make the difference between having meals or having breakfast or being able to send younger brothers or sisters off to school with a lunch. It's one of those things where, yes, we can think about it certainly from a young person's perspective, and we should, because oftentimes their jobs are the most precarious, and the jobs that they can make, for instance, if we're talking about summer employees here at the city, they may not have those jobs after the end of August, but every dollar that they make is hopefully going to go to either family, post-secondary, it's going to be spent. And when we look at the amount of debt of young people these days, hopefully it's going to be spent at trying to eliminate some of that debt. We can think about it from that perspective, but I think we also do a disservice if we only think about young people from that perspective, because they're part of that family unit as well. And the more and more stories that we hear now are young people, not 18 and over even, but under 18, who are contributing to their family income. And it's a shame it has to happen, but it does happen. So the more money that we can help to bring into the family structure, whether it's for somebody who's 18 or over or somebody who's under 18, I think that helps. And the fact that as city councillors you have a direct relationship with those city employees and are able to remedy that for some of them, I think is a great step as well.
Thank you for that. I know from my own family experience and also my own experience as a young worker that absolutely the little that I was making was going into the family pot to help make ends meet. So I appreciate that perspective. I think not everybody is aware of how much young people are contributing to their families as well as their education, and how much they're facing a lot of precariousness. Through the chair, I'm not sure if it's appropriate to ask staff questions related to the topic during a delegation. Could you clarify, please?
I could allow that latitude now, yeah, sure.
Thank you. I'm just curious how many minimum wage employees we do have. The delegate had mentioned 500 employees. Could staff please clarify?
So through the chair? So through the chair, we have, I have a full-time equivalent count as opposed to an actual number of staff count. So we have roughly 125 full-time equivalents. So that equates to your 7 hours a day type of work.
So through the chair, we don't have the information regarding part-time or seasonal employees that are making minimum wage?
So through the chair at this time, I don't have it, but I'm sure we can get that information.
Through the staff, was the city prepared to raise the minimum wage in accordance with Bill 148? Did we budget for that?
So through the chair. Our initial budget preparation back in August, we would have prepared our budgets with the impact of moving the minimum wage from the $14 to the $15 per hour.
Okay. And in our current budget cycle, the funds that were allocated in August last year to meet the Bill 148, now that Bill 47 has taken away that $1 from minimum wage workers, how much of a financial impact or quote-unquote savings are we looking at?
Yeah, so through the chair, yeah, we, moving from the preliminary budget to the budget that was presented to committee and council, we've removed $275,000 from the budget for the impact of minimum wage.
Okay, just so I'm really clear. So it was $275,000 to move our minimum wage employees from $14 an hour to $15 an hour.
Correct. Yeah, so that doesn't include library. I think we heard from the Hamilton Public Library Board. Their impact was $120,000 as well.
Okay. If staff through the chair could help kind of cost out roughly at this point, how much would it cost the city to bring our minimum wage rate up to $15.85 an hour, to the living wage rate?
So through the chair, roughly that would probably be around $500,000.
Okay, so through the chair, at an appropriate time, I'd like to move a motion that the City of Hamilton become a living wage employer, paying all of our minimum wage employees a living wage rate of $15.85 an hour, including part-time, seasonal, and other contract employees, and with annual increases that are consistent with the cost of living. And that B, that staff report back the implications within this operating budget cycle.
Okay. So we are.
When it's appropriate.
So you'd come back then, Councillor, at the end of the meeting under motions or notices of motions later today? Thank you for that. Councillor Wilson, you're next on my list.
Thank you very much. The previous speaker just tweaked an additional question for me through you, Mr. Chair, to Brian. On that, the complement that we have of minimum wage employees, do we have a gender profile of those 125 full-time equivalent?
We have that?
Yeah, so through the chair, no, I don't have that information, and I don't know whether Laura can answer that.
Through the chair, that information is not available, at least not at this time.
So just clarification, it's not available, or we're not able to make it available for whatever restrictive reasons?
Your mic, please.
If it's just, through the chair, if it's just a gender related question, we can get that information. It'll take some time to look at the data.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I would respectfully request that profile. Thank you very much, Anthony, for your presentation. I do have a question for you, if you're able to answer it. You did allude to the, in your remarks, which I'm always curious about, the local economic spin-off of a living wage. And I was wondering if you were able to speak to that, or whether there was evidence of that to your knowledge.
I don't have a study in front of me right now to give that to, but anecdotally, the studies that were done with regards to the minimum wage increase, back when it was being spoken about under Bill 148, was certainly that somebody who is living as somebody who is either working poor or living in poverty, that every dollar they make isn't put into savings. Every dollar they make is generally spent on a local business. The odds of somebody who is working poor, who has purchases to make, or the ability to actually put part of their earnings towards a service of some sort, are probably not going to be going out of town to do that. So generally, any of those extra dollars would benefit the local economy, would benefit some of the jobs within that local economy. You can't specify necessarily that it's going to be small business. It might be a large business. You know, I can tell you, as the labor movement, we have arguments all the time over, you know, some big corporations and some of their practices, and should we support a big business or not. Quite frankly, there are a lot of people who can't afford to shop anywhere else other than some of those large businesses. So when we talk about, you know, the labor movement across the U.S., for instance, is very, you know, anti-Walmart and anti-Target and stuff like that. And we understand that there are definitely some issues at some of those locations, but If you ask somebody who's living in poverty where they can buy food and clothes for their kids when it comes to the school year starting, that's where they have to go because it's the only place that they can afford to go. So we can't say that it's always going to be small business, but it should be, and I don't have the number in front of me, the likelihood is that it's all going to be local business at the very least.
Thank you for that. I do have one additional question. Just in terms of the economic impact, to your knowledge of moving from the 14 to the increase, are you able to speak to whether that had a negative impact on the Canadian or the Ontario economy?
When it was taken away, whether that had a negative impact on it, like when it was repealed, or whether it was increased?
When it was increased.
From all the studies that have been quoted since then, there was a lot of fear-mongering that went on at the time about the fact that there were going to be lost jobs, that the economy would tank, and every report that has come back in that period between it going to $14 has come back saying that all of that fear-mongering was false, and that, as a matter of fact, not only did jobs stay stable or go up, but I think the biggest thing for employers, and it's something that definitely the city can consider as an employer as well, is that job retention stayed there. So we didn't have the attrition that we normally have in minimum wage jobs where people, for instance, like I've got a friend who is a union representative for a union that deals with a lot of cleaners and maintenance workers. And oftentimes they'll have 2 or 3 jobs on the go. And if they get an offer of a shift from a company that pays them an additional $1.50 an hour, they're not going to they'll decide to go wherever they're making more money. So attrition can be a huge deal when it comes to minimum wage. And so for all of the fear-mongering, I don't see a lot less jobs from that jump from $11.50 to $14. I am sure that there were small businesses definitely who had a struggle integrating it in a quick period of time. But I also know that for all of the stories that we had at the time about the concerns, I can't name many stories of businesses who went out of business specifically because of that one item. I'm not saying there aren't any, or I'm not saying that there aren't some who would claim it was because of that. But I've always said I have friends who run small businesses, and I try and have these hard conversations with them. And one of those hard conversations is, if your business plan is set up so that you are keeping your workers in poverty when you're paying them a living wage, then it's an unethical business plan. That's the problem that they have to face. And so I think the increase to minimum wage certainly helped. Like I say, the 500 workers in Hamilton, is it going to have a broad swath of impact across the city? Not by itself, but we hope that it's the first domino in being able to go to a lot of other anchor institutions and start to bring up that standard of living for a lot of workers in the city.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the sentiment about a public entity having to lead by example. Thank you.
Next on my list, Councillor Pauls. Questions for Mr. Marco?
Thank you, Anthony. I really appreciate it, what you're saying, but as a businesswoman myself, that all my life I've had business, and I've hired people. When the government put a $14 increase, we adjusted it to it. And I want to say, working for the city of Hamilton is a great privilege. So if you're saying that the city of Hamilton could go up to $15.85, and you're saying, I understand everybody needs an increase. We've increased it to 14, 15, city of Hamilton. I hire a lot of students in my other business that I just sold to my son. You know, they say, well, the city of Hamilton pays $15.85. And I want you to know that the small business are the drivers of Ontario. And I'm not saying, and I don't want to be painted with a black brush here, I'm just saying I really think it would be too much of a jump from 15 to 15.85 if the standard of Ontario is $14. And I'm compassionate toward people. I want to tell you that in my business, when I had my business, when the students did a great job, I gave them bonuses. When the students took my business into a higher level because they care for people, they did better. And I want to tell you, when the $14 came up, my son literally said, "Oh, Mom, I'll work maybe more, and then it stays in the family." So that's what you're facing with that idea of raising to $15.85. I want to work for the city. Every kid wants to work for the city. Why not? They're paying the best rate. Let's go for the city.
Councillor, just this is for questions from
So that's why I want to ask you
Okay,
what your thought is about the small business, not the institution.
So the proposal that we're bringing forward today isn't about small business. It's specifically about the City of Hamilton as an employer.
Right. And that's what, yeah.
Do I think that there is a potentially down the line a positive spin-off effect that we start to raise wages in this city and across the province? Sure, I do. But I come from a background in labor. That's the first lens that I look at, admittedly. That being said, we don't have the power here to increase the minimum wage. Should we, as employers, try and we're not just talking about student jobs either. We're talking about all jobs, although some of them may be student jobs. We believe that one of the ways that you bring people out of poverty is to raise that wage. The term minimum wage, too, is deceitful in a certain way, just the term itself. At $14 an hour, we call that a minimum wage. At $15.85, we call that a living wage. The living wage is set so that anyone who's making below that, technically, by the math, is living in poverty. So everyone who makes a minimum wage in this province is living in poverty. I have a problem with that. I have a problem with just that on its face, that the fact that our minimum wage is a poverty wage across this province. So obviously I fight at the provincial level to try and change that as well. At the local level, I come to groups like council and do what I can here to say, admittedly, the province hasn't kept up with where we'd like it to be, but locally, as a city, as an anchor institution, as a municipal institution, can we set the benchmark? Can we lead the way? And can we go to other large anchor institutions, like I mentioned earlier, school boards, Hamilton Health Sciences, Mohawk McMaster, and make sure that they're leading the way as well? Because for a small business owner, I would bet that if we had a lot of people in the area of your small business who all of a sudden were making $1.85 more an hour, that you would start to see an increase in business. And that's something that small businesses do well when people have disposable income. Somebody who's making $14 an hour in this city doesn't have disposable income. Somebody who's making $15.85 probably doesn't have a lot of disposable income either. It's a living wage, but actually, in many ways, it's a surviving wage. It's what it takes to survive in this city. So I can appreciate, and I said this to many people who were running small businesses when the minimum wage provincially was coming up. I, as somebody who lives here in Hamilton, pays their taxes here in Hamilton, pays their taxes to the province, if you told me that you were a living wage small business, and because of that I was going to pay 10% more at your store, I would shop at your store exclusively. And I do that with businesses around this city. I have a lot of privilege to be able to say that. I'm fully acknowledging that privilege because I make a good salary in the job that I do full-time. But to me, and to a lot of people in the labor movement, a living wage is an important symbol of saying this is somebody who we think is respecting their employees, is trying to help them out of poverty. And that's why we make a presentation like this today. So I'm by no means trying to dismiss the concerns you have. I think they're real concerns, but I also think that it's a mindset that we have to kind of come to grips with regards to what is the best for small business. Being able to pay as little as possible, or being able to make sure that the people in the area of that small business have the money to spend at that small business. And it's two sides of a coin, and admittedly there's risks on both sides, but I certainly appreciate the question. I appreciate the
And Anthony, I appreciate what you're saying, and I wish we could all raise it, and I wish we could all be above that. But I'm just saying the favoritism of people trying to get a job in the city of Hamilton because they're paying more. That's my only question. How many people does the city of Hamilton have, you said? 500, these 500 are the lucky people. The next year, we hire more. And that's the only question I was, but I have the compassion. I want everybody to do well. So I hope you understand my questioning. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Whitehead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think I was one of the few in the last term of council that actually supported the livable wage motion that was defeated. But I still have one issue. So I certainly support the concept of livable wages, certainly for full-time. Part-time was a little bit tougher for me, but I think you, Anthony, made a very profound argument. But the issue, and I don't see the numbers demonstrated yet, I'm hoping to see it, but we do a lot of seasonal hiring. And it's an introductory and opportunity for youth and students. So this is not about livable wages in the context of them having livable. This is an opportunity for them to be introduced into the job market. And the question is, are students being squeezed out as a result of this movement? And do you believe that livable wage should apply to seasonal work as well?
I believe that living wage, much in the same way that I believe in a concept of, say, universal pharmacare, I believe that living wage has to be universal and not means tested. I think that once it becomes means tested, that there are too many ways that you can deteriorate that means testing to remove people from a living wage. At some level, it's a job that's worth doing. And if it's a job that's worth doing, I believe that it's a job that should be paid a living wage. So if you're to tell me that it's a seasonal job, I will say, yes, it's a seasonal job, but who are the people who are doing those jobs? People who are doing those jobs, maybe students, maybe somebody who's past being a student. But ultimately, if they're past being a student and they're not going back to school, that generally means that they're probably dealing with a family situation. So they may be 18 or 19 years old, but we have a lot of youth in this city, and I say youth even though they're young adults, they're 18, 19, who are dealing with family situations. And I've said this to a couple councillors as I met with them. We may have in our heads that the people who are taking seasonal jobs are students who are only there in the summer and going back to college, university. At some point, we might have to realize that we just have young adults who are trying to raise a family, and every dollar that they make is going to help that family. At some point, we may have to understand that as much as it may not be palatable to us, that we may have a 35-year-old who can't get a job anywhere else and is applying for a seasonal job just so that they can have enough to support their family. The concept of a seasonal job only being at a certain age, I think we're probably moving past that right now. We probably have to get to a point where we realize, A, if it's a good job, it's a job worth doing, and B, and I said this earlier, so I apologize for repeating myself, but the idea that if somebody is doing that work, then if it's a job worth doing, it's a job worth getting paid a living wage for. I mean, that's the basic tenet that we're living by with this. I think that anytime you bring in the concept of means tested into it, saying that it's either this amount of hours or for this duration of time, that can be played with. So, and I'm not saying that anybody in this table, that's the intention, but if you said, for instance, that any job that's under 6 months wouldn't qualify for the living wage, it doesn't take much, 2, 3, 4 years, 5 years down the road to say, well, let's change that 6 months to 8 months or 9 months or 12 months. Or anybody who's under 18, let's change that to anybody who's under 20 or 21. Once you go into means testing, it becomes very easy to nibble away at some of those gains. So that's why we appreciate, in the same way we talk about universality for healthcare, Medicare, that kind of stuff, we talk about universality with regards to these wages as well.
So maybe you're not aware of the programs, but in the summertime, we wait till universities and colleges, and that's when we do the mass hiring for a lot of the seasonal work through the summer. And the program is in fact targeted, not to the people you're talking about, but it's targeted to students to give them that introductory and opportunity to earn an income. So I'm trying to ensure that we don't squeeze students out of the opportunities that we create specifically for them by moving in a direction that becomes, I don't know if it becomes very competitive and squeezes them out of the market.
So as I said earlier, I have no doubt that those are where the jobs are targeted. I think ultimately a question is going to become what happens the first time that you get a 40-year-old single mother or single father who applies for those jobs. Targeted doesn't mean exclusive by any means. So while I can appreciate that that's where the targeting happens, somebody If you were to put the proposition to me as to an opportunity for a student or somebody who is raising a family, I'm not going to pick sides on that, but I'm going to say that one is at least as important as the other if they need the money to make that family support. So opportunity to one person is survival to another person. So I think it's very difficult for me to split hairs between the two, and I certainly don't want to come out here and say that we shouldn't have opportunities for students. But in the rare cases where we have people who just need that job to survive for another 3 months or 6 months, I think that we should be recognizing that anybody can apply for those jobs. And once you do apply for those jobs, it may become a necessary thing in order for you to pay rent and to keep your family going. So I think that's, while we talk about where we target those jobs, that's one thing. But when we talk about the potential of who could actually get those jobs, that could be something completely different as well.
Thank you, Anthony. I really appreciate your frankness.
Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy. I don't have a question for Anthony. Thank you for coming, but I do have a request of staff, so if you tell me when I can do that.
Go ahead right now if you want. You asking for information? Sure. Well, my apologies.
I'm usually good at pushing buttons, but today. So before we begin entertaining any motions down the road, I was wondering if it would be prudent for us to request a report back from staff, because there have been historical reports that have already been completed, and we could have all of that information in terms of what the city is doing with living wage, and by extension, living wage for contractors and outside employers who are doing work for the city. I think it would be important for everyone around this table to have that background prior to deliberating on any motions.
Okay. Madam Clerk, procedurally, would you prefer that under motions today in terms of formally requesting that update?
Through Mr. Deputy Mayor, yes, please, or at least at the end. They really should be through motions. We're in the middle of a presentation as well.
I'll come back to Councillor Clark then under motions. I have no further speakers then. Anthony, thank you for your presentation today. I'm going to need a mover and a seconder then to receive that. Moved by Ferguson, seconded by Vanderbeek. All those in favor? Carries.